June 4, 1944. At a grey, windswept airfield near Saint-André-de-l'Eure, Luftwaffe weather officers scanned barometers that plummeted as rain lashed against the hangars. Their charts showed an impenetrable wall of storms racing across the Atlantic. To the German High Command it was clear. No sane commander would risk an invasion fleet in seas this violent. In Berlin, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel permitted himself a rare breath of relief and returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. But only 48 hours later, before dawn broke on June 6th, Allied landing craft rammed their bows against the beaches of Normandy. Behind the German lines, village mayors recalled the sound of church bells drowned beneath the thunder of naval guns. Reports filed in the Völkischer Beobachter that morning spoke confidently of no landing possible before July. The ink was scarcely dry when news of catastrophe reached Hitler's headquarters. How did the Allies exploit a single, improbable weather window that even the best German meteorologists dismissed? How did this sliver of atmospheric chance, predicted not in Berlin but in a dimly lit room in southern England, become the fulcrum of the largest amphibious invasion in history? And within this storm, how did decisions ripple down to the smallest details? Shift logs at Portsmouth dockyards, ration tickets in Omaha beach canteens, even the half-eaten sandwiches left on weather officers' desks, moments that revealed the fragile line between certainty and disaster. This is the story of how weather, science, and human conviction collided to open Normandy's gate, and how the Reich's trust in storm clouds blinded its marshals at the very hour their defenses were most vulnerable. June 4th, 1944. Dawn broke grey over the French coast, sheets of rain slashing across the roads leading to the Channel. At Saint-André-de-l'Eure airfield, Luftwaffe meteorologists recorded plunging barometric readings. Their reports, stamped and filed that morning, left little doubt. The Atlantic was in violent turmoil. For the German command, these were not just numbers on a page, they were a guarantee. No fleet of liberty ships or landing craft could possibly cross in seas like these. In Berlin, the relief was palpable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B and the most outspoken advocate of coastal defense, seized the moment. Convinced that an invasion was impossible under such conditions, he boarded his staff car and set out for Ulm, where his wife Lucy was preparing for her 50th birthday. The journey, logged in his adjutant's diary, seemed ordinary enough. Yet in hindsight, it would become one of the war's most damning absences. Across the Channel, the storm told a different story. At the headquarters of the Luftwaffe's Atlantic Weather Service, forecasters leaned heavily on charts produced in Paris, where observations often lagged hours behind the fast-moving weather fronts sweeping across the Atlantic. German weather ships, vital for real-time data, had been driven back months earlier by Royal Navy patrols. What the Reich believed to be certainty was, in truth, a blind spot stretching hundreds of miles. Why did no one in Berlin question it? Why did a nation famed for engineering precision trust reports that omitted half the ocean? The answer lies in a paradox. German military doctrine prized meticulous planning, but when confronted with atmospheric chaos, its generals mistook confidence for accuracy. A Red Cross observer later remarked, thinking of these very weeks, they trusted paper more than sky. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Channel, British and American meteorologists argued through the night of June 3rd. Group Captain James Stagg, a Scottish officer attached to Eisenhower's staff, confronted clashing predictions. U.S. Army Air Force's forecasters, relying on shorter-range data, insisted storms would persist for weeks. But at RAF Dunstable, teletype machines clattered with Atlantic readings from isolated stations in Greenland and Newfoundland. Those fragments hinted at a narrow break, a brief high-pressure system slipping eastward between two storm fronts. It was slender, fleeting, and far from guaranteed. Stagg's midnight memo, typed in haste on June 4th, carried a quiet warning. There exists a window on the 6th of June. The probability is narrow but sufficient. Eisenhower read it aloud to his commanders in Southwick House, his voice steady yet burdened by the weight of 1,000,000 lives. Back in Normandy, German coastal units interpreted the storm as permission to relax. Diaries from the 352nd Infantry Division, positioned near Omaha Beach, note that patrol rotations were shortened and a scheduled training exercise for June 5th was cancelled due to weather. A corporal recorded in his notebook that afternoon, "Rain unending. Nothing moves. Perhaps the invasion has been postponed until July." It was a fatal assumption. The very violence of the storm convinced German marshals they had time to breathe. Yet, in the cluttered forecast rooms of England, amid dripping raincoats and empty teacups, men with slide rules and instinct saw opportunity in chaos. Consider this. Rommel on the road to Ulm, hundreds of kilometers inland, unaware that Allied convoys were already assembling off Portsmouth. German reports claimed the channel swells made embarkation impossible, yet dockyard logs in southern England show thousands of soldiers boarding craft under floodlights, their gear soaked but their orders unchanged. How could two sides watching the same storm see opposite truths? The answer, like the weather itself, is a study in perspective. For the Allies, uncertainty meant risk, but risk was tolerable when the prize was a foothold in Europe. For the Germans, uncertainty was mistaken for impossibility. And so, at the very hour Rommel's driver shifted gears on a wet Bavarian road, Allied navigators were plotting courses through the eye of a storm. By June 5th, the deception was complete, not because the Allies had hidden their armies, but because the clouds themselves had hidden the truth. The rain had not stopped by the evening of June 4th, 1944. In a small, dimly lit room at Southwick House near Portsmouth, ashtrays overflowed as maps lay pinned with colored markers across the tables. Group Captain James Stagg, the Royal Air Force's chief meteorological advisor to General Eisenhower, studied the barometric charts spread before him. His Scottish voice carried a quiet urgency. Hours earlier, at RAF Dunstable, teleprinter machines had rattled with reports from weather stations scattered across the North Atlantic, tiny outposts in Greenland, Iceland, and Newfoundland. They hinted at something almost impossible, a small ridge of high pressure pushing eastward, perhaps just long enough to create a 36-hour calm in the storm. Across the table sat his American counterparts from the U.S. Army Air Forces. They shook their heads. Their forecasts, built on shorter observation lines, insisted that heavy seas and low cloud ceilings would persist until mid-June. To them, any attempt to sail an invasion fleet into such chaos was suicide. It was not a polite debate. By midnight, voices had risen. A stenographer's log from that meeting noted the tension. U.S. forecast impossible. Deutsche forecast, possible but narrow. Eisenhower listened in silence, his jaw clenched. Behind him, Admiral Ramsay, commander of the naval forces, ran the numbers. Over 5,000 ships would need steady seas to stay on course. General Montgomery tapped his pencil impatiently, warning that delay risked losing the momentum of secrecy. Stagg returned to his maps, pointing to the faint ridge near Iceland. "It is a window," he said firmly, "perhaps no more than 24 hours. But if we wait, the storm will close." He knew he was gambling not just on physics but on trust. In his private diary that night, he admitted, "One is never certain, but one must convince men who hold the fate of Europe in their hands." At the very moment this debate raged in England, German meteorologists were reaching the opposite conclusion. In Paris, Luftwaffe forecasters telephoned their assessment to Berlin. Unsettled weather continues. Conditions not favorable for major operations. The message, filed on June 5th, gave the German command every reason to dismiss the threat. With Rommel already in Ulm and Hitler asleep at Berghof, no one challenged the forecast. Back at Portsmouth, the men in uniform were faced with a decision Eisenhower later called the most agonizing of my life. The invasion had already been postponed once, on June 5th, when seas pounded the channel too violently for small landing craft. To delay again meant dismantling the operation, sending hundreds of thousands of troops back to camps, and risking leaks of secrecy. Even the newspapers hinted at impatience. The Times in London carried cautious speculation about unprecedented troop movements along the coast. Then came the hook of fate. At 4:00 a.m. on June 5th, Stagg delivered his verdict. His words, as recalled by a naval officer present, were steady. "If you launch tomorrow, you will have a fighting chance. If you wait, you may not get another window for 2 weeks." Eisenhower turned to his commanders. Montgomery nodded. Ramsay sighed. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory frowned but did not object. The room fell silent as Eisenhower stood, hands behind his back. At last he said, "Okay, let's go. What did that sentence mean in practice?" In the dockyards of Portsmouth and Southampton, Night crews were immediately ordered to resume embarkation. Canteen records from the Portsmouth Naval Base show that more than 30,000 hot meals were served that day, hastily distributed to men boarding landing craft. Soldiers wrote quick postcards, "We sail tonight," before handing them to chaplains collecting last mailbags. Mechanics worked double shifts to refuel Shermans and load 105mm howitzers onto flat-bottomed craft. Meanwhile, the storm still raged above them. Rain lashed the quays, and sailors muttered that the operation was cursed. One American private scribbled in his diary that evening, "We are marching into hell under a sky that tells us no." Yet in the forecast room, Stagg held to his fragile ridge of pressure, certain that by dawn the clouds would break. It is worth pausing on the irony. At the exact hour that Allied troops filed into landing craft, German divisions near Caen were dismissing their own night drills because of poor weather. One corporal in the 716th Infantry Division recorded on June 5th, "Storm, training suspended. Alert reduced to half strength." While German sentries slouched beneath dripping helmets, tens of thousands of Americans, British and Canadians crouched in steel hulls, waiting for the tide to carry them toward France. By trusting a narrow gap in the storm, the Allies had chosen audacity over caution. By trusting certainty where none existed, the Germans had chosen blindness. Within 24 hours, that divergence would shatter Europe's western gate. The Channel storm was still pounding on June 5, 1944, yet across southern England, the invasion machine had already begun to stir. In the tented cities around Portsmouth, Southampton and Plymouth, soldiers woke to the dampness of canvas roofs, dripping on their bedrolls. By dawn, long mess hall queues stretched across muddy fields where the day's rations were issued. Powdered eggs, bacon, white bread and coffee served in tin mugs. The Portsmouth Dockyard canteen records for that morning note over 32,000 breakfasts consumed before 08 hours, an industrial feeding line fueling men who knew they might never eat again. The atmosphere in these camps was tense, a blend of boredom and dread. In one corner of a Nissen hut near Southampton, a private from the 29th Infantry Division wrote a final letter home, tucking it into an envelope marked, "Only to be mailed if I do not return." Chaplains collected such letters by the sack, assuring the men they would be delivered if fate dictated. The Stars and Stripes front page that morning carried only vague references to massive operations, but the soldiers needed no newspaper to confirm what loomed ahead. In the motor pools, mechanics checked and rechecked the engines of jeeps, Sherman tanks and amphibious Douquet trucks. Each was stenciled with chalk numbers tied to specific landing waves. A corporal on duty later recalled in his journal, "Every vehicle had to be fueled and waterproofed. Even the exhaust pipes were sealed with tar. We could not afford one machine to drown on the sand." The detail was staggering. Each jeep required 20 gallons of fuel, each Sherman 75. By mid-afternoon, entire columns of armor were already lashed onto flat-bottomed landing craft, waiting for the order to sail. At the airfields further inland, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne and the British 6th Airborne rehearsed their jumps one last time. They scribbled chalk graffiti on the sides of their gliders, messages like Hitler's nightmare and London calling. Their pockets carried more than ammunition, many stuffed in chocolate bars, gum, or a single photograph from home. A British sergeant later wrote, "We laughed loudly because the quiet was unbearable. And yet, for all the tension, ordinary rhythms still intruded." Canteen stands sold Coca-Cola and Hershey bars to American GIs. English volunteers, many of them women in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, drove supply trucks through the rain, delivering crates of ammunition and loaves of bread to embarkation points. Their khaki uniforms, mud-splashed and practical, contrasted sharply with the polished helmets of the soldiers' boarding ships. This convergence of worlds, civilian women driving 3-ton trucks while men prepared to storm fortified beaches, spoke volumes about the social upheaval the war had already wrought. At Portsmouth, one dockworker remembered the scene of embarkation vividly. There were so many helmets lined along the quay. It was as if the sea itself had grown eyes. The ships themselves seemed endless, rows of Liberty ships, each capable of carrying 9,000 tons of cargo, now loaded with artillery, rations and fuel. Naval logs show that by late afternoon, 5,333 vessels were on alert, ready to move at the signal. But beneath the scale, human frailty was visible everywhere. Seasick soldiers leaned over railings even before leaving harbor. One paratrooper clutched a rosary as he climbed into a C-47, whispering prayers as engines roared to life. In the final hours, an officer walked the decks reading aloud Eisenhower's written message, "The eyes of the world are upon you." Men cheered, but in the silence that followed, the weight of those words sank deeper than the roar of the storm. Now imagine the contrast across the Channel. While English canteens pushed out tens of thousands of meals, German divisions along the Norman coast were rationing bread, typically 250 grams per man, per day, and expecting nothing more than routine drills. In one French village near Bayeux, German troops lounged in cafes, sipping ersatz coffee, watching the rain streak across shuttered windows. To them, the storm was a shield. To the men waiting in the quays of Portsmouth, it was a curtain about to rise. By nightfall, embarkation was complete. Soldiers huddled in cramped quarters, writing last words on scraps of paper, listening to the rain drum against steel decks. One American lieutenant, quoted later in his battalion's newsletter, described the moment as like waiting in a darkened theater, the curtain heavy, the stage silent, but knowing that the play would begin with thunder. The storm had not passed, but the decision had been made. In a few hours, thousands would surge across the Channel, betting their lives on a fragile forecast. While Allied soldiers crowded into landing craft under the driving rain, the German defenders across the Channel read the same storm as Providence. On June 5, 1944, the German High Command issued a routine communiqué declaring the Channel seas unfit for operations. The words, filed in Berlin and distributed to coastal divisions, became a kind of collective lullaby. Along the beaches of Normandy, the Atlantic Wall stood as Hitler's pride, a fortress of concrete bunkers, minefields and artillery. Yet even this mighty line bore the stamp of compromise. At Omaha, strongpoints coded WN-62 and WN-72 bristled with 75mm guns, but elsewhere the defenses were patchy, trenches unfinished, wire unstrung. The 352nd Infantry Division, tasked with guarding a 30-mile sector, counted just 12,000 men stretched along nearly 50 kilometers. Its regimental log for June 5th records simply, training suspended due to storm. The weather offered more than respite. It provided an excuse. German doctrine assumed that any invasion would come under clear skies, with air superiority contested. Rain and low clouds, they believed, gave them time. As a result, some coastal units reduced alert levels. Guards abandoned observation posts to huddle in barns. An infantry corporal stationed near Pointe du Hoc later wrote in his diary, "It was too wet to see the sea. The invasion would not come this week." Higher command reinforced the complacency. Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief in the West, had long warned that the Atlantic Wall was a facade without mobile reserves. Yet his pleas clashed with Rommel's insistence that the beaches must be defended at the water's edge. On June 4th, Rommel left for Ulm, believing the storm bought him days. His absence was more than symbolic. With him went the most energetic advocate for readiness, leaving behind staff officers who deferred decisions until morning. The irony deepened inland. Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's best armored units, remained positioned south of the Loire, far from the beaches. Its tanks were fueled, but without Hitler's personal authorization, they could not move. On the night of June 5th, when telephone wires buzzed with confused reports of unusual Allied naval activity, Hitler was asleep at the Berghof. No one dared wake him. The Führer Directive of 1944 required his explicit approval for armored deployments, a bureaucratic bottleneck that, in practice, froze Germany's most powerful counterattack force. Contrast this paralysis with the Allies' frantic pace. As German officers studied weather charts in Paris, dockyard crews at Portsmouth were loading thousands of tons of ammunition and 1.5 million gallons of fuel into vessels. At Caen, by comparison, Wehrmacht quartermasters logged a delivery of horse fodder and potatoes, the daily staples for troops along the coast. The gulf was not just material, it was mental. The Germans believed they had weeks. The Allies believed they had hours. Civilian life around the Atlantic Wall mirrored the contradiction. In Bayeux, French villagers saw German troops gather in cafes, sipping ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Yet only a few kilometers away, bunkers echoed with the metallic clang of last-minute repairs. The illusion of calm coexisted with the urgency of war, and no one could reconcile the two. At midnight on June 5th, the Luftwaffe's weather service confirmed its fatal error. A new report concluded that storms would last until mid-June. It was signed and filed without objection. Hours later, Allied convoys were already slicing across the Channel, guided by radar beacons and shepherded by destroyers. A German sergeant in the 716th Division summed up the mood that night in a letter intercepted weeks later by the Allies. "We have been spared once again. The invasion cannot come in such weather." He was wrong by only hours. By dawn, the storm would reveal its betrayal. The Atlantic Wall, vaunted as impregnable, would face an armada larger than any in history. Its gunners half awake, its commanders absent, and its armored divisions chained to a sleeping dictator. The Channel that had churned with fury on June 5th fell eerily calm by dawn on June 6, 1944. A pale moon hung over the horizon, its light flickering across a steel armada. From horizon to horizon, ships stretched in endless lines, 333 vessels, the greatest fleet ever assembled. Destroyers plowed through the swells, battleships steadied their massive guns, and landing craft rocked heavily as they carried men toward the unknown. Admiral Ramsey's log for Aero 230 recorded simply, "Convoys in motion, weatherfare." For the men aboard, the calm was deceptive. Rain still clung to their uniforms, and the taste of diesel and salt filled the cramped holds. Soldiers of the 1st and 29th U.S. Infantry Divisions huddled shoulder to shoulder in the belly of Higgins' boats. Many were seasick before the ramp even lowered. A corporal later remembered staring at the grey dawn and whispering, "This sea looks like glass, but it will kill us." Above them, the air filled with the drone of engines. More than 11,000 aircraft circled over the fleet, C-47 transports towing gliders, B-26 Marauders poised to strike beach defenses, and fighters patrolling the skies. At 0:20, paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne had already jumped into the dark hedgerows of Normandy, their silhouettes vanishing into clouds. Some landed in orchards, others in flooded fields deliberately created by German engineers. Confusion reigned, but their task was clear: seize bridges, cut roads, and sow chaos before the beaches erupted. On the German side, the night was quiet, almost too quiet. Observation posts that might have spotted the approaching armada were manned at half strength. Coastal artillery batteries near Cherbourg reported visibility limited by haze. In Caen, officers of the 21st Panzer Division were attending a war game exercise, believing no landing was possible until July. The scale of what approached them lay completely outside their imagination. At 05:45, the silence shattered. Allied battleships opened fire, their 14 and 15-inch shells screaming toward the coast. The French village of Virville-sur-Mer shook as the ground convulsed. A farmer later recalled, "The earth rolled as though giants had struck it with hammers." From miles offshore, the USS Texas and HMS Warspite pummeled bunkers with relentless precision. Yet many of the German defenses, buried deep in reinforced concrete, survived. By 06:30, landing craft churned forward. At Omaha Beach, ramps splashed down into waist-high water as men plunged into a hail of machine gun fire from the 352nd Infantry Division. German gunners had been dozing hours earlier, lulled by storm forecasts. Now they fired into a human tide. Navy coxswains recorded seeing bodies pinned to the tide line, while medics fought to drag the living from the surf, and still the fleet pressed forward. At Utah Beach, strong currents carried American forces nearly 2,000 yards off course, but luck favored them, landing in a sector with lighter defenses. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., landing with the first wave despite a cane, looked at the shoreline and said calmly, "We'll start the war from here." His presence became a rallying anchor for men scrambling through flooded dunes. The contrast could not have been starker. On the bluffs above Omaha, German rations of 250 grams of bread and ersatz coffee sat untouched in bunkers, breakfast abandoned as guns roared. On Allied decks, canteens served last swigs of hot tea, poured hastily before men leapt into the surf. Two armies confronted one another across a strip of sand, no wider than a football field, yet separated by entire worlds of expectation. Why had one side prepared for catastrophe while the other prepared for calm? The answer lay in those lost forecasts in Rommel's absence, in the conviction that storms were stronger than men. But the weather had turned, and now steel, fire, and blood would decide the day. As the sun rose higher, the beaches of Normandy became the crucible of Europe. And for every soldier who fell, the gamble of June 6th was written not in charts or forecasts, but in the smoke drifting above the Channel. At dawn on June 6, 1944, while Allied destroyers hammered the Norman coast and paratroopers fought in flooded orchards, Adolf Hitler still slept. At the Berghof in Bavaria, his staff had orders never to wake him without urgent cause. To them, the storm reports filed the previous evening meant no cause could exist. Thus, at the most decisive moment of the war, Germany's leader remained oblivious, his generals bound by a protocol of silence. In France, paralysis set in. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander-in-chief in the West, telephoned Army Group B's headquarters for clarity. Reports were contradictory. One message claimed enemy landings near Bayeux. Another dismissed it as local diversion. Without Hitler's authority, Rundstedt could not release the armored divisions he had begged for months to station closer to the coast. Panzer Lehr Division, with more than 200 Panthers and Panzer IVs, sat immobile, its orders frozen. Meanwhile, Rommel was not even in France. Still in Ulm for his wife's 50th birthday, he received the first alarm around 10 a.m. His driver immediately turned the staff car back toward Normandy, racing hundreds of kilometers along rain-slicked roads. Hours lost on the Autobahn would mean hours lost on the beaches. Rommel's personal notes later captured the shock. We had believed the storm had made invasion impossible. Now it was upon us. On the ground, the defenders fought with what they had. The 352nd Infantry Division near Omaha, only partially manned and exhausted from weeks of construction duty, suddenly found itself the pivot of history. Its commander, General Dietrich Kreis, radioed for reinforcements at 07:15. But with communication lines shredded by naval bombardment and Allied paratroopers cutting junctions inland, his pleas were delayed, misdirected, or ignored. At Hitler's headquarters, time bled away. Jodl and Keitel debated whether the Normandy landings were real or merely a diversion for the main blow at Pas-de-Calais. Their caution paralyzed response. Only at 10 Seeters did Hitler awake and grant permission to release 2 panzer divisions. By then, the Allied bridgehead was firming under cover of naval guns that outmatched anything the Wehrmacht could muster. The irony was striking. At Caen, French civilians remembered seeing German officers riding bicycles between villages, frantically seeking fuel for stalled vehicles. While the Allies had brought 1.5 million gallons of gasoline across the Channel in floating drums, German panzer units scrounged in farmyards for extra cans. A captured lieutenant told interrogators, "We had tanks but no orders and orders but no fuel." Meanwhile, Allied momentum built relentlessly. At Utah Beach, supply officers logged 20,000 men and 1,700 vehicles ashore by nightfall. At Omaha, though carnage was appalling, destroyers crept to within 800 yards of the beach, firing point-blank into pillboxes until breaches opened. The German defenders, stunned by the scale of firepower, retreated piecemeal. Still, German propaganda clung to denial. At 12 Nassau, the Wehrmacht radio communiqué insisted, enemy landing attempts repelled. Yet in Berlin cafes, customers noticed the contradictions. A copy of the Berliner Morgenpost from that morning, confidently predicting invasion weeks away, lay beside news of Allied landings now undeniable. The free press was gone, but the murmurs of doubt spread quickly. By evening, Rommel was still en route. Hitler was still convinced Normandy might be a feint, and Rundstedt still lacked freedom to act. In contrast, Eisenhower had already received the first coded message. Troops are ashore. 2 chains of command, 2 ways of seeing the storm, one decisive, one frozen. As night fell over the bloodied beaches, the Germans faced a truth their forecasts had hidden. The storm had not saved them. It had betrayed them. The myth of the Atlantic Wall had been built on propaganda as much as concrete. Posters in Berlin had shown towering bunkers, impregnable cliffs, machine guns raking the sea. Yet when the tide withdrew from Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, it revealed not a fortress untouched, but a coastline littered with broken steel, flooded trenches, and dazed survivors of shattered companies. One striking image survives in the American records. At 8:30 a.m., Captain Joseph Dawson of the 1st Infantry Division led a handful of men up a shell-pitted draw. Behind them, the sand was blackened by naval fire. Ahead, German pillboxes smoked. A Navy destroyer, the USS Satterley, had risked grounding to unleash salvos that silenced positions the infantry could not reach. The official log notes she fired 345 rounds before noon. One ship, one section of beach, turning the wall into rubble. But victory was never guaranteed. General Dietrich Kreis's 352nd Infantry Division had fought stubbornly, its soldiers hidden in trenches that aerial reconnaissance had missed. They had only been reinforced weeks earlier by conscripts, Polish, Czech, even Russian volunteers in German uniform, yet they slowed one of the best-trained divisions of the U.S. Army for hours. "We thought they were ghosts," an American sergeant later wrote. "They kept firing even when we were in the wire." Inside a field bunker overlooking Colleville-sur-Mer, German telephone operators tried to relay coordinates back to Corps headquarters. Here, women's roles appeared in the German war machine too. Female auxiliaries of the Nachrichtenhelferinnen Corps tapped out urgent signals, their headsets crackling with static. One survivor remembered, "typing faster than I could think, as if speed could change the outcome." They could not. Allied naval artillery drowned their coordinates in fire and smoke before orders reached batteries inland. By midday, the contrast between sides was clear. American soldiers at Omaha survived on hastily issued rations, a 12-ounce can of meat and beans, 600 calories of chocolate, and lukewarm water carried in canteens. German defenders, who had expected to be rotated to rear billets weeks before, fought on half rations of black bread and ersatz coffee. A corporal captured near Vierville told interrogators that his last hot meal had been 3 days earlier. A thin soup with one potato between 4 men. Hooks appeared everywhere in the chaos. At Point du Hoc, Rangers scaled 100-foot cliffs using ropes and ladders, while German defenders hurled grenades down. By afternoon, the cliffs were smeared with smoke and blood, but a ranger signaled with a flare, "Objective seized." Yet when engineers inspected the supposed heavy guns, they found only wooden dummies. The real 155mm artillery pieces had been dragged inland days earlier and hidden under camouflage in an orchard, discovered only hours later by patrols. Even civilians felt the shudder of collapse. In Caen, a parish church rang its bells in confusion, first as warning of air raids, then, as townsfolk whispered, in cautious hope of liberation. Allied leaflets, dropped by the thousands, told villagers to stay inside until the front passed. One boy later remembered picking up a leaflet in English and French, its ink blurred by rain, promising, "We come not to conquer, but to free." By nightfall, the Atlantic Wall was broken not by sheer force alone, but by the collapse of its illusion. Concrete could not substitute for mobile divisions. Discipline could not substitute for gasoline. And Hitler's forecast, that storms would shield him for 2 weeks, lay exposed as a deadly miscalculation. Yet the cost was staggering. At Omaha alone, over 2,400 American casualties were recorded in a single day. For Germany, the 352nd Division lost nearly 1/3 of its strength. As medics worked under the fading light, a question hung heavier than the smoke. If this was the cost of the first day, what would the coming weeks demand? The first night after D-Day offered no pause. In the bocage country beyond the beaches, hedgerows centuries old formed walls of earth and thicket that baffled Allied infantry and armored divisions alike. Each field was a fortress, each lane an ambush. For German defenders, the terrain seemed to promise recovery, yet their doctrine, built around rapid counterstroke, was already unraveling. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, reporting from his command post on June 7th, pleaded with Berlin, "We must end this battle. Withdraw behind the Seine." His message reached Hitler's headquarters at the Wolfschanze, where it was rejected outright. Instead, the order came to hold ground at all costs. Doctrine demanded attack, but the means no longer existed. Fuel stocks had been bombed out of depots, armored trains delayed by wrecked bridges. Panzer Lehr, one of Germany's best-equipped divisions, managed to push toward Caen with only half its fuel capacity, leaving tanks stranded along the roadside. Meanwhile, The Allies brought not just divisions, but a new kind of logistical mastery. At Mulberry Harbour A, constructed off Omaha within days, engineers logged the arrival of 6,000 tons of supplies in the first week, an output that rivaled mid-sized German ports. Liberty ships disgorged crates of powdered milk, steel helmets, even crates of Lucky Strike cigarettes. One British observer noted that even frontline troops had more butter in a week than a French civilian had seen in a year. The contrast was painful for captured soldiers. In one Red Cross inspection at Bayeux in mid-June, German POWs were recorded receiving 3,300 calories daily, nearly double what Wehrmacht ration standards had shrunk to in France by that month. A French farmer who watched the process remarked bitterly, "The prisoners eat like kings, while we queue for bread." The war had inverted expectations. Conquerors became captives, and captives ate better than civilians. The emotional turning points inside the German command were equally stark. Rommel, now back at the front, argued bitterly with General Friedrich Dollmann of the 7th Army. "You cannot ask men to die in open fields under this fire," Rommel warned, noting Allied naval shells tore craters large enough to bury a truck. Dollmann insisted orders must be obeyed. Within weeks, Dollmann would be dead, officially from a heart attack, though many suspected suicide under unbearable pressure. Even as German doctrine collapsed, a different kind of order was being quietly imposed behind Allied lines: re-education. At temporary POW camps near Cherbourg, American officers distributed translated pamphlets describing democratic principles and outlining the Geneva Convention. "We must plant seeds even in defeat," one U.S. Army chaplain wrote in his diary, recording his evening service held in a makeshift tent where German prisoners, some Lutheran, some Catholic, quietly sang hymns they had once sung at home. In Britain, officials already prepared curricula for a future beyond the war. By August 1944, the U.S. War Department had authorized over 10,000 volumes to be shipped into POW libraries. Books ranged from Goethe to Mark Twain, from engineering manuals to biographies of Lincoln. In the middle of the greatest battle of modern history, the Allies were planning not just to defeat Germany, but to remake Germans. The paradox deepened with every mile inland. As Allied tanks pressed toward Saint-Lô, French villages emerged with flags hidden since 1940. Yet alongside jubilation came fear: homes burned in bombardments, fields ripped by armor. A farmer's daughter recalled seeing a Sherman tank roll past her orchard and thought, "The old world is gone. Even the hedges cannot stand." By late June, the Bocage War had claimed thousands of lives. Yet the real defeat for Germany was invisible: the collapse of a doctrine that relied on speed, certainty, and control. The very storm that delayed Rommel had opened the way for an enemy whose strength lay not only in men and guns, but in supply tables, floating harbors, and lesson plans for prisoners. The question that lingered in both German and Allied minds was chilling: could a nation taught to obey orders without question ever be taught to embrace freedom instead? By July 1944, the battle for Normandy had become a war of exhaustion. The hedgerows swallowed men and machines alike, but the Allies pressed relentlessly. The turning point came at Saint-Lô, a town reduced to rubble by days of aerial bombardment. On July 25th, the U.S. First Army unleashed Operation Cobra, a storm of 2,500 bombers dropping more than 3,000 tons of explosives on a front barely 10 miles wide. The ground shook so violently that American soldiers miles away thought it was an earthquake. German soldiers of the 352nd and 2nd Panzer Divisions endured the barrage in foxholes and cellars. Survivors recalled the sky falling in blocks. One captured officer told interrogators, "We had no trenches left, only craters, and no men left to hold them." In those hours, the Wehrmacht's cohesion cracked beyond repair. Panzer turrets were blown from their hulls, and communication lines snapped as entire regiments ceased to exist. When the infantry advanced, it was not with glamour, but with grim determination. American units, including the 30th Infantry Division, clawed their way through smoke and dust. The hedgerows that had once favored German defense now became traps, as tanks fitted with rhino blades, welded steel tusks improvised by engineers, smashed through walls of earth and brush. In reports, officers noted tanks breaking through 10 fields in under 20 minutes, a speed unthinkable only weeks earlier. The innovation shattered German expectations. The breakout spread like fire in dry grass. Within days, 100,000 German soldiers were retreating toward the Falaise Pocket, harried by fighter bombers. The Allies' mastery of logistics proved decisive. Supply depots recorded unloading 9,000 tons of ammunition and fuel per day by late July, enough to sustain an advance across all of northern France. German convoys, by contrast, often carried little more than 15 gallons of petrol per truck, barely enough to reach the next depot. A sergeant in the 2nd SS Panzer wrote bitterly in his diary, "We drove until the tanks stopped, then walked until the shells fell." For civilians, St. Lo symbolized both liberation and tragedy. The town was so pulverized that reporters called it the capital of ruins. The New York Times on July 30th described streets where not a single wall remained higher than a man's head. Yet amid the devastation, French families emerged from cellars, clutching tricolor flags and portraits of de Gaulle. In a single week, they had exchanged 4 years of occupation for the terror of modern war, and still greeted their liberators with tears and bread baked from whatever flour they had hidden. Inside German headquarters, despair turned into recrimination. Rundstedt, once again urging withdrawal, was dismissed. Rommel, wounded on July 17th, when Allied aircraft strafed his staff car near Livarot, was already out of action. The army in France had lost its most capable field commander just as disaster approached. Hitler, convinced that Normandy was still salvageable, ordered a counterattack at Mortain on August 7th. But without fuel, and under skies ruled by Allied thunderbolts and typhoons, the assault collapsed within hours. The paradox of the battlefield was mirrored in the treatment of men. German POWs captured after Cobra were processed in camps where U.S. Army cooks logged rations of 20 ounces of meat, 2 loaves of bread and potatoes daily, a diet richer than most French villagers could imagine. One Red Cross observer in August wrote, "The prisoners look healthier each day, while civilians grow thinner." War had inverted every scale of justice and hunger. By early August, the Wehrmacht in Normandy no longer fought as an army, but as scattered remnants. The Atlantic Wall had not just cracked, it had disintegrated. And in its collapse, the road to Paris stood open. The final act of the Normandy campaign unfolded in the narrow fields between Falaise, Argentan, and Chambois. By mid-August 1944, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trapped, their retreat corridors closing under relentless Allied pressure. Historians would later call it the Falaise Pocket, but for those inside it was a cage of fire. On August 19th, Canadian and Polish units linked with U.S. forces at Chambois, sealing the encirclement. What followed was slaughter. Allied artillery registered firing over 250,000 shells in 3 days, while aircraft strafed roads, choked with horse carts, trucks, and fleeing infantry. German diaries spoke of columns stretching 10 miles destroyed in place. One officer described dead horses lying so thick on the road we had to climb over them. The numbers were staggering. Out of roughly 100,000 German troops encircled, only half escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The 7th Army effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Captured documents show entire regiments reduced to fewer than 200 men. When Canadian troops entered Trun, they counted 2,000 vehicles abandoned in one sector alone, burnt-out panzers beside bicycles and wagons piled high with personal effects. For the Allies, the pocket was both triumph and horror. A Canadian officer remembered the silence after the guns. Not a bird sang. Only the sound of boots stepping through wreckage. Yet the victory cleared the path to Paris. On August 25th, Free French armored units under General Leclerc rolled into the capital, greeted by jubilant crowds waving flags and flowers. Parisians who had queued for watery soup weeks before now handed bottles of wine to soldiers, chanting, "Liberté." As bells rang across the city, the collapse in Normandy was more than military. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. Hitler's refusal to withdraw had cost him armies he could never replace. Within weeks, Allied planners estimated German losses in the West at 400,000 men since June, a figure nearly equal to all Axis losses in North Africa 2 years earlier. Logistics had done what no fortress could, broken the Wehrmacht's spine. Yet amid the ruins, a different future was being drafted. In prisoner camps near Cherbourg, and later across the Atlantic at Camp Hearn in Texas, re-education programs gathered momentum. By late 1944, the U.S. Army reported more than 20,000 German POWs enrolled in language and civics courses, learning about democratic institutions, the Marshall Plan's early outlines, and vocational skills they would carry home. One inspector, Colonel Edward Davison, noted in November, "These men speak now of a Germany rebuilt not by conquest, but by schools and labor." The paradox deepened. While German civilians scrounged for coal and bread in ruined cities, their captured soldiers were reading Mark Twain in barracks libraries stocked with 15,000 donated volumes. Some POWs later testified that these classes reshaped their view of authority more than any battlefield defeat. A sergeant recalled, "For the first time we were told not what to think, but how to think." Religion, too, played its quiet role. Chaplains reported Sunday services in camps, where Germans sang hymns beside American guards. At Christmas 1944, POW choirs performed Stille Nacht in candlelit mess halls, their voices carrying through barbed wire into the night. Even in captivity, seeds of reconciliation were being sown. The legacy of Normandy was thus twofold. On the fields of Falaise, the German army was annihilated. In the classrooms and chapels of POW camps, a future Germany was being reshaped. The storm that had betrayed Hitler's forecasts had opened a gate not just for Allied tanks, but for the birth of a new Europe. The final question lingered over the rubble and the silence. Could nations torn by fire and tyranny truly rebuild on freedom and trust? The answer carried into the Marshall Plan, NATO, and decades of peace began on those beaches, when the storm broke and the wall fell.